I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Al Tillery, who is coming to us from the Political Science Department at Northwestern University. He is the director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy, and his work centers on American politics and political theory, and he's specializing in Black politics. In 2011, his book Between Homeland and Motherland won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. He also is the co-editor of a volume with Christina Walbrecht, Rodney Hero, and others entitled The Politics of Democratic Inclusion, which is a book that I've used a lot in my teaching. And de Tocqueville, he also writes a lot on de Tocqueville and American political theory, and has published really interesting pieces in American Political Thought and Political Research Quarterly. Recently, he's written an article with Tabitha Bunala called "Which Identity Frames Boost Support for Mobilization in the Black Lives Matter Movement?" And it presents some experimental work. And he also is presented with Cressfield, a really interesting study on the depiction of West Indian immigrants in the Black press and the Journal of Black Studies. He's a leader in our field. He co-led the diversity hackathon at APSA in 2018 with Mala Tun, and in general is a leader in the study of American politics, political theory, and Black politics. So we're very pleased to have him here today. So today his talk will be on, will take about 35, 40 minutes, we think, and then we will be taking questions after that. In the meantime, while he's talking, rather than interrupting, we'd ask you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll start with those questions after Professor Tillery is finished speaking. His talk today is entitled "The Performance of Power, Black Lives Matter and American Democracy." And I'm very pleased to turn the floor over now to Professor Tillery. Welcome to SFU, Al.
Thank you, Laurel. It's so good to be here. I'm really excited about having a conversation about the BLM movement today. So I'll just dive in and share my screen. And we'll get started. So the title of my lecture, "The Performance of Power, Black Lives Matter and American Democracy," is about the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and my work in trying to understand how the movement fits in to our long sort of history of social movements for racial justice in the United States. And what I'm going to try to talk about today are the origins of the BLM movement at roughly 6 or 7 years old, depending on how you count, theories of the movement, how BLM communicates on Twitter, how the US media covers BLM, and Black public opinion and behavior related to the Black Lives Matter movement. So the origins of the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement started on July 13th, 2013, when 3 women, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, posted hashtag Black Lives Matter on Twitter in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Now, Marcus Anthony Hunter, who's an academic and head of the UCLA African American Studies Department, had posted hashtag Black Lives Matter in December of 2012, but the movement really crystallized when the hashtag went viral in response to what Garza, Tometi, and Cullors posted in July of 2013. Black Lives Matter became a slogan and organizing principle for 35 grassroots protests that erupted in response to the deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown in Ferguson in the summer of 2014. This was what we call the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, the first concentrated wave. Estimates of the number of BLM protests that have taken place since 2014 range from 100 to 2,500. We know from analyses that the New York Times did of cell phone data last summer that the second wave of Black Lives Matter protests that started in response to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, Breonna Taylor being shot by police trying to serve a no-knock warrant at her home in Louisville, Kentucky, And then, of course, the death of George Floyd under the knee of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, which went viral. The New York Times estimates that this is the largest mass movement in American history. We know that the second wave saw sustained activism in more than 100 cities for 3 months. We know that something on the order of 96, 97% of those movements were completely peaceful. Not only was there no violence, there was no property damage. And we also know that the second wave was somewhat different from the first in the sense that it was multiracial and multi-generational. I don't think any of us can forget the image of the 75-year-old white Vietnam veteran in Buffalo, New York, with a cane, using his body, shielding protesters from police who just kind of, knocked him over with their shields and marched over him and sent him to the hospital for several weeks, right? And so the movement of 2020 has become a sort of nationwide global reckoning over racial inequality. And so I do write and think about that movement, but what I'm going to present to you today is mostly my research on the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests, which ran from 2014 through 2015 was the height of that, first wave. And I'm going to talk primarily about Black political behavior and attitudes toward the movement, right? Before I get into the data and the findings, I want to talk about the theories of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are primarily 4 theories or heuristics that we use to think about the emergence of the movement and how it fits into the history of social movements in the United States. The first theory is what we call the long civil rights movement thesis, and this is, the best examples of this type of research are Chris LeBron's 2017 book on the Black Lives Matter movement, and Megan Francis, her recent work on activism around police violence. The second thesis is the neo-Marxian or class politics thesis. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, a sociologist and African-American studies scholar at Princeton, which she argues is that we saw such a robust uprising in the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests because it was a working class movement. And coming at the end of Barack Obama's presidency, where the economics of Black America didn't really change, 4 out of 10 Black Americans remained poor. Something close to 6 out of 10 remained economically precarious. That what we see in the Black Lives Matter protests and the intensity of the protests is an uprising against capitalism as normal, right? And so I actually have done some empirical work that I believe substantiates Taylor's thesis, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The other thesis is the feminist or LGBTQ politics thesis. This is, really expounded upon by Trevor Lindsay of Ohio State and Barbara Ransby of the University of Illinois, Chicago. They argue that this movement is different from the classic civil rights movement because Black women and queer Black women in particular are at the center of this movement, of leading this movement. They argue that the movement is non-hierarchical and that it centers the lives of queer and trans women in ways that would have been unimaginable 2 or 3 decades ago, right? And then there's the new social movement thesis. And that thesis, it says essentially that the Black Lives Matter movement is different from the civil rights movement in the sense that it's not really a movement that seeks instrumental gains. It doesn't really try to shape politics. It's really about performance. It's really about performing the diverse identities that are, extant in the Black community, giving voice to them, giving voice to cultural expressions about Blackness, and that is what we should expect. We should never expect a centralized, politically engaged movement that seeks to shape outcomes in a very instrumental way, right? Now, I think that there are elements, explanatory power in all of these theories of the movement, but I think it's important to take the movement activists who are out there in the streets at their word. And so the BLM activists, they tend to see the movement in the feminist LGBTQ politics vein. They argue the origins of Black Lives Matter is rooted in the labor and love of queer Black women. This is Alicia Garza's famous essay from 2014, right? I also think that the new social movements dimension proposed by Harrison Rickford, stressing the ways in which the movement doesn't elevate sort of organizations or centralized leadership in a hierarchical sense, the way that the movement stresses disruptive tactics, interrupting people having lunch in the downtown square, or blocking highways. These are two of the favored tactics of movement organizers in the first wave, right? So what I wanted to do with my empirical work was to try to figure out if we adopted some of these theories, feminist LGBTQ politics thesis or the new social movement thesis, could I find evidence to support one or another of these, arguments or theories in empirical research? And so I funded a bunch of studies. We probably had about 7 to 10 studies that are ongoing through my Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy, which I founded in 2017. And so this has been the CSDD research agenda on Black Lives Matter. And the bottom line question for us is, what is working for this movement? And can we use any of these theories that I've just told you about to interpret the movement? And so we focused on messaging. I published a paper called What Kind of Movement is Black Lives Matter? The View from Twitter a couple years ago in 2019, about how movement organizations message on Black Lives Matter. What do they say the movement is about? What are they saying to their adherents? We ran one of the first nationwide studies among the Black population in America about how the movement was landing on Black communities. What do they think about it, right? We've got a paper coming with the Social Science Research Council and another paper that I've had under review for a while that looks at this class element. I'll tell you about that. And then political behavior. I've run a bunch of experiments with my colleague, Tabitha Bonilla, on what identity frames can do to get people to mobilize and actually go out and protest. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is just present some of these findings to you. So the messaging studies. What I wanted to know in the messaging studies is, are BLM activists consistent messengers? Meaning people like Alicia Garza, if we go back a couple slides, she's saying that the movement is rooted in the labor and love of queer Black women. So what I wanted to know in these messaging studies is that a consistent theme in the messages that Black Lives Matter activists and organizations post on Twitter? I also wanted to know, how do these BLM messages land on the media? How do they evaluate what they're saying, right? And so that first paper I told you about, What Kind of Movement is Black Lives Matter? This is one of the tweets, one of the charts from that paper. This is what I wanted to know is, if you look at the Twitter activity of Black Lives Matter organizations, what are they talking about? So we studied 18,708 tweets that were sent on Twitter between January of 2014 and November of 2016. We looked at 6 different organizations affiliated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we expected to find is that the vast majority of the frames, a frame is, what do the activists say the movement is about, right? And so that's exactly what Garza gives us. She gives us a queer politics frame, right? And so we expected LGBTQ frames and feminist frames to be really the leading messages among these Twitter accounts. What we found is that that's not the case. What we found is that overwhelmingly liberal frames, 67% of this batch of tweets sample, were saying things like, you know, Black people have rights in America. Stop, sort of searching us illegally. Stop, over policing our community. So the frames are mostly about kind of individual rights, claiming these rights under the American Constitution, right? Now, the second largest batch of tweets were about cultural references, right? And so that is a distinctive style of the new social movement, is to talk about the culture of the group. And we found that there's a lot of celebration of Black icons who they thought were contributing to the movement. Beyonce, Colin Kaepernick, right? There's a lot of talk about Beyonce's formation video and its cultural significance, right? Third largest category were feminist frames, right? Talking about gender issues and the contributions of Black women to the movement. LGBTQ plus frames represented 7% of the sample, and only 3% were explicitly racial frames, right? And so I think that that's so low in part because one, the hashtag Black Lives Matter is expressing a racial kind of valence, right? And then also all of these cultural frames are frames about race to some extent as well, right? So that was very surprising to us, is that we found so much of the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter is the rhetoric of individual liberal rights. And I think, one thing that we're trying to tease out now as we look at the second wave is this communication part of why we saw it was so easy for other racial groups to join with the second wave of protests once they saw that viral video of George Floyd, right? That's one theory that we're testing with some other means. I also wanted to know, what is Black Lives Matter urging people to do on Twitter, right? So if the dominant sort of, behavior of new social movements is that they urge people to engage in disruptive protest actions, what we expected to find was that most of the tweets would have told people, hey, let's go block the highway or protest. Interestingly, we found just the opposite. Only 12% of that 18,708 tweets urge people to protest. Overwhelming majority of tweets that urge people to action urge them to do things like register to vote in the election so you can defeat this LA County commissioner who's racist. The NAACP is having a voter registration drive. Go and register. Register and vote for Kim Foxx, who's going to be state's attorney in Cook County, Illinois, and is proposing police reform, sentencing reform, right? And so most of the tweets are urging systemic political action. And that's something that is really interesting, and that we think in some of our subsequent studies, what we're looking at is how Black Lives Matter is now trying to affect politics. And we've got one study of voters in Georgia that showed that Black Lives Matter messaging around voting behavior was really a crucial factor in putting Senator Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff in office over their two Republican opponents and flipping the US Senate from Republican control to Democratic control, right? We also looked at how Black controlled media and white controlled media covered, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and what they were saying about their messaging. What we found is that we looked at 1,571 news articles between 2013 and 2017. And we found that the Black media were mostly neutral. About 50% of the articles, they were not clearly positive or negative on the movement, right? The second largest category, 42%, were positive. Very few were negative. And so that is interesting. We expected the white-controlled media, or as we say in America, the mainstream media, to be negative. And what we found is that that wasn't the case either. They are pretty much evenly split between neutral and positive. Only 10% had a negative appraisal of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we also wanted to know, was the media saying that the movement was winning? Were they being successful in their efforts? And so we looked at 722 items between 2013 and 2017. 78% didn't pick any winners, right? When they did make a statement about the outcome, 15% said that they were winning, and only 7% said that they were losing, right? When we looked at Black-controlled media, they see things pretty much the same way. The vast majority weren't able to tell whether the movement's winning or losing. But where they did make a statement about winning or losing, you know, more said that the movement was winning than not, right? So that's very interesting. The public opinion studies, what we wanted to know was, do Black people like the Black Lives Matter movement? And do Black people think the movement is effective? And so Pew Research did a study in 2016 that showed that there was a large partisan divide on the movement among whites. Not surprisingly, white Republicans are strongly opposed to the movement. You know, white Democrats were more supportive. And so we wanted to figure out, what if you just asked African Americans how they feel about the movement, right? So we did a survey run by Qualtrics panels on behalf of the CSDD. It's a 25-item online survey, interviewed 815 African Americans. And the survey was in the field from September 22nd to October 4th, 2017. We had a pretty good census match. We were, 50.43% male, 49.33% female. We had, the 815 respondents lived in 39 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Really, the only states that were missing were the states like, Wyoming and Montana and Maine and places where there are like almost no Black population, right? So we hit all of the major Black population centers. 50% of the respondents earned between 30K and 75K per annum. 18% earned less than 20K, and 12% earned more than 100K. So that's pretty good. 25% of the respondents were high school dropouts. 32% were high school graduates. 26% held four-year college degrees. So our sample was slightly more educated than the Black population is on average. And we had pretty good split between suburban and urban residency. Oops, sorry. So what we found is that Black people in our survey really liked the Black Lives Matter movement. We found this in all 4 of the studies that we've done, and I've increasingly reviewing papers for journals that have numbers that are very similar to this study that we did in 2017. 81% of respondents in our survey saw the Black Lives Matter movement as at least moderately effective, right? 59% thought the movement was good at providing economic opportunities for Blacks. 56% saw the movement as an effective advocate for LGBTQ rights. 63% thought it was effective at protecting Black Americans from police brutality. 68% thought it was effective at protecting the voting rights of African Americans, right? And so this is a very popular movement in the Black community. Now, it wasn't a movement that our respondents thought was perfect. We asked our respondents if they thought the movement would be better if they had one centralized leader in order to speak on its behalf, right? And overwhelmingly, like 2/3 of our respondents said yes, right? So then we asked them, well, who do you want to be the leader of this movement? And we got some interesting results. Colin Kaepernick was going away, the person that our respondents thought should be the face of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then after Kaepernick, it was Alicia Garza, who pretty much was the face of the Black Lives Matter movement in the media. And then we can see Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors. They're also listed. People like DeRay McKesson and Brittany Packnett Cunningham and Samuel Sinyangwe, who are people that have sort of an adjunct status to the movement. They're very outspoken activists on Twitter. Brittany Packnett Cunningham was on President Obama's task force for 21st century policing. Janetta Elzie is a very well-known activist in Chicago. DeRay McKesson ran for mayor of Baltimore. So, but we think that this Colin Kaepernick artifact or finding in our survey is an artifact of when we ran our study. If we go back here, we ran our study between September 2017 and October 2017. That's the height of American football season, when our newly elected president, Donald Trump at the time, was targeting Colin Kaepernick as a kind of unpatriotic, drain on America for not standing for the national anthem and kneeling in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're going to run this question again on a survey that we're going to launch this summer in the wake of, likely another summer of uprisings, given all that's happening around the killings of Black and brown men at the hands of state authorities in the United States. So we'll see what we find. Next, we looked at political behavior. We wanted to know what motivates Black people to participate in the movement. And so we took the data from that 2017 survey. We had, 5 categories of response, from never to very often, right? And we just ran standard demographic control variables to see, what variables are making people more likely to participate in BLM protests. And so, these are the control variables. Age. We want to know, does being older make you more or less likely to protest? Being highly educated, more or less likely to protest? Being a woman, more or less likely to protest? Having Hispanic heritage, high income, strong Black consciousness, high degree of liberalism, high degree of linked fate, meaning that you believe that your fate is linked to the fate of other Blacks, right? And so, this is somewhat technical. The only thing that you need to know is that where you see a negative sign, it means that people are less likely to participate in a protest. And where you see a positive sign, it means that they're more likely to participate. And these asterisks denote varying levels of statistical significance. So this is the 0.01 level of significance, meaning there's a kind of 1% chance that these results are wrong, right? That this is not a statistically significant result, right? And so being older makes you less likely to join a Black Lives Matter protest, despite the amazing veteran that I referenced earlier in Buffalo. It is not surprising that older people are less likely to protest, right? Being more educated makes you less likely to protest. This is surprising. All of the literature on what we call civic volunteerism in political science has told us that people who are more educated have more resources to engage in all kinds of political activity, including protest. The literature on Black politics also has told us, for a variety of reasons, ranging from a rejection of, the system, having more encounters with white people that make you activist. We would expect more educated people to engage in protests more. Yet what we found is that the more educated you are in our sample, the less likely you are to join a protest. And so what that means is that, Keeanga-Yamahtta-Taylor is right. The first wave of Black Lives Matter protests is a working class uprising to some extent, right? And that's very interesting. Now, this one is the big finding for us: gender. We're told that Black Lives Matter is a movement built by women, led by women. We expected to find that women would be the modal protester. They are not. In fact, being a woman makes you less likely to protest. I think there are a variety of reasons for this. The protests can often be dangerous. They can also be sites where sexual violence happens against women, right? And then the most important reason is probably care needs, right, in these communities. So that's something that we're teasing out in subsequent studies. This finding was really interesting. When you leave out the political variables, what we found is that having Hispanic heritage, being what my co-author Tabitha Bonilla and I call a Blacktino, right, Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-Cuban, makes you much more likely to protest when you don't control for the political variables, as we do in Model 2, right? But that the result goes away when you control for those things. People with high incomes protest less. People with high degrees of Black consciousness protest more. People who define themselves as liberal protested less. And people with high degree of linked fate, saying that what happens to them matters for other Black people, what happens to other Black people matters to them, makes you want to protest more, right? And so this is just a sort of a plot at the 95% confidence interval. This is basically just a kind of visualization of all of the coefficients that I just had on this table. So you see gender, less likely to protest, Hispanic more, age, income, education less, etc. So the final thing that I want to talk about is, let's skip ahead, questions of, intersectionality, right? We wanted to look at survey experiment on movement frames. We wanted to do regressions to see that if we could figure out through a survey, if some of the framing, some of the dominant framing around identity related to the movement that's coming through from activists, does that make people want to participate more or less in the movement? So, what is the work that intersectionality in particular is doing with the Black Lives Matter movement? Do intersectional frames make people want to protest more? Do intersectional messages mobilize subgroups such as Black women and Black LGBTQ plus identifiers mobilize more? Do intersectional frames demobilize Black men or non-LGBTQ plus identifiers? That's what we wanted to find out, all right? And so we did a survey experiment, sample of 845 Black residents of the United States. We did it in February of 2019. We randomly assigned each respondent one of 4 treatment messages, and then we asked about support of BLM and how much they had engaged in protests. These are the frames. We had a neutral control frame that says Black Lives Matter was created in response to the sustained and increasingly visible violence against Black communities in the US. They believe in elevating the experiences of Black people as American citizens with constitutional rights. They are intentional about amplifying the particular experience of violence Black people face. So this is the control. We had a nationalist treatment. It says Black people as a distinct nation within a nation through an ongoing call and struggle for reparations for the historic and continuing harms of colonialism and slavery. So think Black nationalist movements, think like Malcolm X, right? Like that's the nationalist frame that we're going for. The nationalist frames have been proven by, people like Todd Shaw and Darren Davis to have a really powerful impact on mobilizing Black communities. So we wanted to see if that would work with our respondents. And then we had the intersectional frames, right? Black Lives Matter believes in elevating the experiences of the most marginalized Black people, especially women. They are intentional about amplifying the particular experience of gendered violence that Black women face. So that's the Black feminist frame, and we had the Black LGBTQ plus frame. Black Lives Matter is elevating the experiences of the most marginalized Black people, especially those who identify as queer, trans, gender non-conforming, and intersex. They are intentional about amplifying the particular experience of non-heteronormative violence that Black LGBTQ plus individuals face. Now, our hope has, a good feminist scholar like my colleague Tabitha Bonilla, a good ally. I think that I'm a good ally. I hope that my colleagues in the discipline of political science think that I'm an ally to women and queer colleagues. We were hoping to prove that these frames send people running to the streets to protest for Black Lives Matter. And what we found was actually just the opposite. What we found is that for Black men, when you look at the feminist and the LGBTQ plus frames, it actually demobilizes them. It makes them mobilize less. When you talk about those frames, it makes them think the movement is less effective than when you do the nationalist treatment, right? And then they're less supportive of the goals of the movement when you talk about it in a feminist and LGBTQ plus frame. What about Black women? Black women in our sample were not less likely to support. They weren't demobilized if they received the feminist or LGBTQ plus treatment. But what was so interesting for Black women is that the feminist treatment and the LGBTQ plus treatment was less potent than the nationalist in every one of our frames, except for support of the movement. Here, the LGBTQ plus and the nationalists have an equal impact. And then when we index them, what we found is that the LGBTQ plus frame slightly outperforms the other two in the index when you sum all three of these together. And so, that really took us aback, right? I mean, it really made us think, we've got to think carefully about how some of these messages are landing on the Black community, some of the divisions in the Black community, some of the work that still needs to be done, particularly among older Black Americans. But I will say there's an interesting paper coming out at the Journal of Black Politics run by INCOPES that I reviewed by Shayla Nunnally and the brilliant Amber Spry, two brilliant scholars. And what they find is that, interestingly enough, older Black Americans are somewhat more supportive of the movement than middle-aged and younger Black Americans, right? And so I don't even think that all of this work to do more, to talk about the importance of these other frames, it's not about perhaps just convincing old folks. It might be that these frames need to be married with other frames in real time, like the economic frame that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is telling us to look out for and that my own research supports, in order to make the translation and to hold the movement together. So when you ask about like, what's the impact of Black Lives Matter on the community and in broader American democracy, like, is Black Lives Matter winning on its own terms? It's clear they're winning in Black public opinion, mixed with white public opinion. And media commentary seems to me like they're winning. Their own messaging seems to be having a mixed effect on the community. And also their ability to mobilize seems to be mixed, right? And so those are some things that I think we need to be attentive to when we're thinking about the next step of this movement and its impact on American democracy. And so I want to thank everyone at SFU, and especially my friend Laurel Weldon, for this kind invite. And I look forward to hearing what's on your minds after this rather long dump of information. Sorry about that.
Please don't apologize. Super interesting. So much to learn. I'm sure that everyone has many questions. I know I've learned a lot from this presentation, and thank you so much, Al, for such an really interesting set of insights. We do already have a few questions in the chat, and I invite others to put their question in the chat too, so that we can address it. I'm just going to start with the first question that we have here from Sonia Orlu, one of our graduate students, who's asking if you can talk about how your research differentiates between the movement, or does it differentiate? Could it talk about the relationship between thinking about the movement, BLM as a movement, and as, let's say, an organization, a set of organizations? She says, do you think a distinction between organization, a set of organizations, I think also she might ask about a distinction between organization and movement matters empirically, and she says, and socially speaking. I'm not sure about what she means by socially speaking, but can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a great question, and this is something that, like, Tabitha and I and the other folks in the lab that I'm funding on these questions, have thought a lot about, right? And so BLM's really different. I mean, the reason Fred Harris, Bo Rickford, two smart people I really respect a lot, sort of classed it with these new social movements is because, BLM, the most visible activists, they explicitly say that they don't have a central organization, right? They say that their kind of Movement for Black Lives website is a clearinghouse for information, right? And so they're not the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, where there were 6 definable organizations. We call them the Big Six: NAACP, Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, National Council of Negro Women, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, et cetera, right? Like, they're not doing that. And so we are talking at the level of movement in all of our framing studies, because which organization would we pick? Now, in some of our web scraping work, like that we did with Twitter, there we are using organizations as the unit of analysis, right? So that Movement for Black Lives website, and then we picked 5 websites from cities that had the most activism in the first wave. So New York, LA, Ferguson, Chicago, DC, Maryland, Virginia, right? So like, where were the big protests, right? So we looked at those organizations, but it's a tricky question, and we try to be mindful of it all the way through. But I'm not sure that there's a right answer. I don't think the distinction matters that much socially because of what the activists say. And I always want to stay true to what the activists are saying about themselves. I do think, that last study that I referenced but didn't show you information about, where Tabitha and I proved that, or showed that when you give white people in Georgia frames about, what's motivating them to vote for Democratic Senate candidates, and we gave them like a tax frame, a COVID frame, a frame on Black Lives Matter, and a frame on Breonna Taylor, say her name. Like, the last 2 frames are what drove white people to the polls in Georgia in real time, right? And so who did that? Like, organizations did that. Black Voters Matter, right? Like, so like, that's an organization that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement that, we can explore their impact in real time through web scraping, through interviews, through surveys. And so as they continue to take stands in politics and try to affect elections, we're going to focus more on the organizations. So.
Yeah, we have some other really great questions here. Hopefully we can get to all of them. So the next question we have is a question from Aaron Hoffman, who's asking about your results here, saying, why do you think that people who identify as liberals are less likely to protest in light of your finding that liberal themes are most prominent on Twitter?
Yeah, so that's a little different, and I wasn't clear on that, Aaron. Thanks for pushing me on that. So I meant like liberal in the sense of like Enlightenment philosophy, right? Like individual rights, republicanism, the right to non-interference, constitutional liberalism. The battery of questions that we asked in the survey was about that classic scale, rate yourself from conservative to political liberal. And so I think that liberals are less likely to protest, in part because it's an artifact of the income finding. Although we did run the regressions, with income and liberalism in the sample were not, highly correlated, right? But I do think that there's a kind of educational level dimension to it, where people who are liberal are not the ones that are experiencing the class inequalities, right, that are shaping the movement and driving people to the protests. So these liberals, they're probably tacking the Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, right? But they're not going down to downtown Chicago and being on Michigan Avenue because, Adam Toledo was shot 2 weeks ago, right? But they support the movement. And then Tabitha thinks, and another one of our collaborators, one of our grad students, Justin Zimmerman, he has been doing a lot of focus group work in Austin and Gresham, which are like poor Black neighborhoods on our South Side, and like they're like two of the poorest census tracts in the city. And what he's finding is that when you ask people about their values, they typically espouse these liberal values, like schooling for everyone, social welfare for everyone. But when you say, "Are you liberal?" they say, "No, that's not me," right? Because they kind of associate liberalism with a sort of effete sort of bearing that they don't see themselves as having. So we're definitely going to do a set of studies this summer to try to figure out like what's going on there and disentangle it. But those are my best guesses.
Thanks, Al. So we have some more questions here. Another one from Sonia, which I am going to just ask you because I think it comes right out of the last answer you gave, which is about thinking more about this kind of ideological differences here. And she's asking, what is the response of non-liberal or non-democrat? I think she's thinking of like more conservative Black Americans to the movement. And did you have any findings about what frames are more or less likely to appeal to this group?
Yeah, so Black conservatives also love Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Wow.
I mean, it's really, interesting. And we thought there would be more partisan, divide there. We do see it somewhat, like when we go into Georgia and we're asking that 3 to 4% of Black folks who voted for like Purdue, and what was the woman's name? Oh gosh, it's been 6 weeks polling on her.
Right, I know, I can't remember her.
Yeah. Those folks, they're like watching. Do you guys have Fox News in Canada? I hope you don't. Oh, okay. So they're watching like Fox News, and they're like, "Oh my God, the Black Lives Matter movement is scary." Like that 3 to 4%, like they don't like the movement, but like overwhelmingly, like even Blacks who identify as Republican and may or may not have voted for Romney or Trump tend to like the movement because they don't see it as violent. They don't buy the framing of it, and they're voting Republican for these other reasons, right? So it's really things to do with evangelical Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks. We have Bianca here has a question about whether you can say anything about what you think the best approach is for activism on social media from your research, or is activism in the media just performative? She's asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that's like the title of my talk is Performance of Power, right? And so,
Mhm.
so the big divide between social movement scholars when the first wave of BLM started, it's like, oh, these kids are just on Twitter. Like, they're not changing hearts and minds. They're not negotiating with members of Congress. They're out of the process. And so the point I like to make is that like that performance can translate into power, right? Like those performances are why police shootings haven't stopped, but they haven't really escalated either, right? They're at like pretty much the same level they were over the last 3 or 4 years, and that's not normal. They've typically escalated year over year, right? And that's because of these protests, right? And so we also see that this kind of Twitter activism and these disruptive protests, they change the calculations of politicians for good and bad, right? So, I think Black Lives Matter definitely needed to grow up a lot from 2014, 2015. Like to say, we're just over here tweeting. We're not an organization. We're a clearinghouse. We're not going to discipline anyone affiliated with our movement, right? That hasn't really worked for them, right? So when activists kicked in the Nike store in Chicago last summer and started taking things out of the Nike store. And one of the activists said, well, that's reparations, right? Well, every Black pastor that's running violence interruption programs in Austin and Gresham and the South Side of Chicago came out and condemned that. And they were like, what are you talking about? We spend 365 days a year trying to keep our boys and girls out of gangs. And you're talking about this is just reparations, right? So they had to like adjust their behavior and rhetoric to how much power they were having, right? We also see that, they had to learn a lesson when Mr. Trump made them the focal point of his campaign, right? Like, you can no longer say Trump is just and Hillary are the same, as they said in 2016. Well, that's just not true, right? And that's why Black Voters Matter emerged, and that's why they started running ads for Ossoff and Warnock, right? And so they're growing up, they're learning in real time, and so who am I? Some guy, some middle-aged, cisgendered, Harvard and Morehouse educated professor to say to the activists, oh, like you're just performing and like try this and like they're having a huge positive impact. And so like I'm willing to give them space to figure it out, but I do think that they need to adopt a centralized communication strategy, and they need to discipline strategy. Like, so what do I mean by that? So when you have white men shooting each other down in Portland, Oregon, at Black Lives Matter protests, and no one from your organization comes out and says, that wasn't us, like we disavow that kind of violence, right? It leads to a co-optation of the movement that can make it problematic. And so what did that do? It empowered Mr. Trump's ability to frame the movement as violent. And, the Democrats believe that that's why they only have a 6-seat majority in Congress now. Now, I don't think that's true. The data doesn't support that. I've been screaming that at the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, since November. I've been giving them a ton of data. They just don't believe it. And so if you had a Black Lives Matter activist saying, that's not us, this is what we stand for, we disavow that, and then also let's fund some ads for you, as they did in Georgia, it's harder to dismiss them, as the Democrats did immediately after the election. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful, I think. Let me go to a question from my colleague, Claire McGovern, who says, thanks for a fascinating talk. Interesting to see your finding on women being less likely to join the BLM protests. Are there any data on women and non-protest BLM activism, such as like Twitter or contacting political representatives, boycotts, and so on, that we could think about?
Yeah, I have data on that. Women are way better at that stuff than men. You know, if Black Lives Matter tweets everybody register to vote, like the women are going to register more, they're going to drive the registration, they're going to write to members of Congress. That's absolutely true. Yeah. Our
Great.
APSR talks about that a little bit, but we're getting more into it with our coming studies.
Okay, great. I'm just going to talk, and now we have a question from Marcus McCauley, who's one of our graduate students. Do your findings suggest that the BLM movement is in danger of splintering or gaining greater prominence? Given the origins of the movements among LGBTQ plus activists and the seemingly recent broader appeal in the Black community, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, but how does a decentralized movement splinter, right? And so, you know, it's been really interesting to watch like Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors, who say that they're not leaders of the movement. I mean, I'm just going to say, like, they've totally enriched themselves off of their work in this movement. I mean, you know, Opal called me and said, "Oh, can you give me like $50,000 to come and talk at Northwestern, or I'm doing my book tour?" And I'm like, no, that's like, you know, a quarter of my annual budget for, I mean, you know, I can't, you know, and so they have totally moved on to other things. Black Futures Lab, you know, they're on the cover of Cosmopolitan, you know, so like they're not even like leading the movement anymore. So like that's happening. And then you do have these kinds of local splintering, right? Where you see activists in a place like Kentucky moving early into politics, trying to affect local elections. Or Ferguson. I mean, the biggest story of election 2020, other than Ossoff and Warnock, is Cori Bush unseating the Clay machine in Missouri. Like, a leader of the Ferguson uprisings is now a member of Congress, right? Like, I'm like super excited about that, right? And so the question isn't so much of splintering, because I think that there's not really much unity to begin with. The question is, can these disparate elements work together enough to be a Black Lives Matter coalition? And can you get like old people in Congress out of the way to let them have an impact, right? Can you convince, you know, Jim Clyburn and Nancy Pelosi to like just sit down and listen to the young people? Like, that's going to be the hardest part, in my view. Right?
That's great. Thank you. So we have a couple of great questions from my colleague, Alina DeRoy. The first one is a kind of a broader question, which is asking you to speculate. Can you speculate about the extent to which your findings from the first wave with regards to frames and public opinion, for instance, hold in the second wave? And to what extent might they apply to movements in other countries like the UK and Canada? I mean, any sense of those things out?
So I don't really have a clue about the second question, because I just don't work on those countries. I've got grad students that are doing things on BLM in the Dominican and, you know, in the UK. You know, the pandemic has really slowed down our ability to do anything meaningful there. What I'll say about the frames, though, is that I did, through my first wave studies, look at some of the international BLM sites, Twitter feeds, and the messaging seemed to be pretty consistent with what I was finding on the US side.
Okay, great. What about the question about the first one, about like whether the first wave frames hold in the second wave, or is that something?
So we're collecting data on that now. We've been collecting data since last summer, and yeah, I don't have any clear evidence of that yet. We definitely did the scraping, and I've had, you know, students reading that material, but I just don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, the specific question that Alina had, and I had actually had a similar question too, about the education findings, which are really interesting. she was wondering whether your negative effect of education might be explained by your sample. You mentioned higher educated individuals were overrepresented, and it makes Alina wonder whether those with a lower education are atypical, maybe particularly supportive of BLM or the likes. And I also was wondering about those kinds of educational, like what you might have said. I mean, you had that interesting working class hypothesis, but anyway, I'd like to hear more about that too.
Yeah. So they're not overrepresented that much in the sample. Okay. You know, the sample is still overwhelmingly people who make less than $75,000 per annum, and so I'm not terribly worried about that driving the effect. I do think that there is probably, and you know, this is what my student Justin Zimmerman has been working on. There is a very real, and this is what Kianga argues, right? There's a very real spatial separation now between where middle-class Blacks live and where working and lower-class Blacks live. And the BLM protests are happening in the latter neighborhoods. And people are not getting in their Volvos and driving from, you know, Hyde Park in where the University of Chicago is, right, which is the kind of seat of the Black middle class, or Beverly, to Gresham. It's just not happening to be part of the protests. Now, the downtown protests are a different matter, right? Because there, I think you're right. We might benefit from a kind of you know, field sampling of those protests, which we would love to do when we're not engaged in the pandemic. Because what I've just observed as a kind of participant observer is that those protests are overwhelmingly selecting, you know, college kids, right, from you know, the local university, driving a lot of that activism. And there's a real splinter between the kind of protests that are led by the college kids and the protests that are organic to the community. And we saw that last summer in Chicago. Like, Mr. Trump is like, we're going to send the National Guard to, you know, Chicago to help with gun violence. And the college kid-led protests in the downtown center are like, we don't want Trump's troops, right? The protests in the you know, the neighborhoods are like, maybe that's a good idea. Like, please do send them if you are serious and you want to help us, right? And so I think that, you know, the problem is probably the online sample more than the kind of class effect of, you know, having, you know, 10% more people who are college educated in the sample than a census demographic would project. They're just not enough there to drive that finding. Not enough overrepresentation there to drive that finding. But what I will say is that it's really hard to do a meaningful look at the class dimension without, you know, a field survey, because, you know, I'm not going to spend, even if I had it, I don't have it, I'm not going to spend $80,000 random dialing Black people when I know that the vast majority of people are not participating in protests to try to, you know, tease out the class effect. But if I could get to where the protests are and do some field sampling, that would be a powerful way to test for all these concerns. So I'm just hoping that we'll get to a point where I'll be able to do that.
Looks like we have a third question from Sonia. I wanted to just before maybe insert a question of my own before getting there, which is to just ask you, Al, about if I'm understanding your findings correctly, if you think I'm interpreting them correctly. So I think one of the things that is sort of, there's some kind of contradictory, or not contradictory is the wrong way, mixed, I guess, is the way you characterize them. And I would agree with that in terms of looking at the kind of role of the movement in mobilizing, say, people across different intersectional identities. This is the thing that I'm especially interested in. And it seemed like you said you found in your research that women were less likely to be mobilized than men to attend in-person protests. So one thing is that perhaps that, if you're right, that it's carrying responsibilities or something, perhaps that's explained by some of the other elements that you mentioned, like as Claire suggested in her question. But I wondered if one way you were going, and then in terms of your experimental work on the frames, it sounds like what you're saying is that these frames that center, say, queer Black women or Black women more generally, are mobilizing for women and for people who identify as LGBT possibly, but maybe are demobilizing for Black men. I'm not sure if that was what you were saying.
Right. Yeah,
and
no,
so, okay,
exactly.
so then how do you, so I guess I'm interested to know, what is your thinking about like how to go forward? I mean, I had been thinking that, if you had these additional frames, you could expand the kind of population that's mobilized by the movement to include more women, queer people and the like. But maybe your research suggests that if you mobilize one group, you'll demobilize another group. I'm interested to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, I think that, I don't think that I don't think that those are opposite. I think in the real world, those are not separate questions, right? I mean, I think that, you're an activist on the ground and your rhetoric is going to move some people and not move others, right? And so you've got to be cognizant of, how much you're doubling down on one frame versus other frame. And so my suggestion when I've been in dialogue with BLM groups, right, or activists, is that it's not stop messaging on, intersectionality and, feminist issues. It's also message on class issues, jobs, also message on, issues that will move Black men, right? And so that was always the genius of the movement in the 50s and 60s. Very simple, universal messaging. So the claim of Garza, Tometi, and Colors, and a lot of other activists, is that the intersectional messaging should do more to mobilize everybody versus a nationalist frame. That's exactly what they have said time and time again. We set out to prove them right, and we prove them wrong, at least with this one set of experiments, right? And so what that means is that they've got to rethink their strategy, right? And so I think that that's exactly what happened in Georgia. If you look at the ads that Black Voters Matter and all these affiliate groups are running in Georgia, they're running ads about more universalistic messages, right? And so I think it's evolving. And it's also true that, Black women, the nationalist frame for them was just as potent as the feminist and the LGBTQ plus frame. Which might mean that they're just ready to go. It might not be that. It might be that they're just what Nadia Brown, our friend, says. They're just like the super mobilizers. They don't care, right? Yeah. But if elections are swung because the Republicans can pick up 1 to 2 to 3 percentage points of Black and Latino men in these neighborhoods, yeah, the activists and the politicians have to be cognizant of how these messages are landing on, these folks, right? And so, like, I study the demand side of this equation, right? Like, what do the people want? What, and so, like, it's not clear that they only want this talk of intersectionality.
Yes.
That's what I think I'm saying.
Very interesting. Thank you. Lots of food for thought. Had one last question from Sonia. I think I know what your answer will be, but I'll pass it along anyway so we can end on this, which is to talk about she's saying, is there a gap between the belief or perception about success of BLM and actual success of the movement? Maybe to just think of this as a question about, can you talk about this sort of success of the movement or how you perceive that? And particularly in the eyes of Black voters and participants.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sonia. I mean, there's definitely, there's definitely a gap. Black people love and think the movement is way more successful than perhaps it is. But at the same time, the movement has made some really important contributions to these communities. I mean, the reason that police officers are finally being charged in these egregious cases is because they are, because of this movement. The reasons that elections are close in some of these places with high Black population is because of this movement. And so I think that there's always going to be some gap within Black political culture, because Black political culture valorizes movements, right? I mean, my first book was about like the Free South Africa movement and Marcus Garvey, and I would go into my barbershop in Hyde Park and I talked to the cats there, and they'd be like, "Oh, we read your book, Tillery, and why don't you think Garvey, Matt?" And I'm like, "Why do you care about Garvey? You're like, that movement. My grandfather was born in 1926. That movement ended in 1924. But they're so they're really invested in the story of these movements, 3 generations later, right? And so that's just part of, I think, Black culture, right? And so I think that to some extent the movement is benefiting from that baseline tendency that we have to valorize movements for progressive change in the Black community. But I also think it's doing a lot of good work. And people, but there is always this dilemma of performance legitimacy. What I know is that there are many in these communities that believe that the activists don't really understand the communities, that they are, often undisciplined in sense of, what they're proposing. Most Black people in these communities don't want the police abolished. They want less racist policing, but they rely on the police to, intervene when there's gang violence, right? And so at the height of our Black Lives Matter protests in Chicago last summer, it was also the peak of a transition in the sort of the rivalry between 2 gangs on the south side of Chicago. And you have Black Lives Matter activists downtown urging for abolition of the police, and Black voters in these districts are urging for more police protection, right? And so that's where the movement's got to really figure out what its aims are. So
that's so great, Al. Thank you so much for these comprehensive answers. You'll see in the chat that everybody is really so thankful for your great answers to this. I want to wrap it up there. Thanks the audience for these great questions and for turning it out at a kind of difficult time in the semester and the pandemic for everybody. And thank you so much to Professor Tillery for agreeing to share this new research with us and under the same kind of crazy conditions that we're all working under. We really appreciate it. And it's really been great to have such a stimulating and engaging talk.